Okay, thanks very much.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so yeah, welcome everybody to my talk today. I'm very happy to have the chance today to present to you an ongoing research project with two colleagues from the University of Bremen, Philipp Kerner and Torben Klahl, with a little bit long title, Green Technologies, Environmental Policy and Regional Growth. Okay, so perhaps a short outline for today's talk. I will give a very brief introduction into the topic and on the background of our research. Then I will say a little bit more about empirical strategy, the data we use, and the estimation techniques we employ. And the focus for my talk today really is on the results part, which is pretty much rooted in where we currently stand with this project, and also why this is kind of, on the one hand, the perfect moment for a talk on it, at the same time, a little bit more complex, because the whole title is actually rooted in the fact that in the paper, in case anybody has taken a look at the working paper, we have both a theoretical model, then have the empirical analysis on the productivity effects of green and non-green knowledge. And by linking that theoretical model with the empirical results, we also gain our sayings about what are potential effects by environmental policies and ultimately on regional growth. But for this talk today, we are currently at the stage that we received some very nice but also fundamental comments on how to improve the paper. And currently we are both under revision with the theoretical model as well as the empirical analysis. And today I really want to present you some really fresh empirical results that we gathered, which we are ourselves still in the process of trying to make sense of, thinking about what could that mean, what are the next steps for analysis we need to take to really back this up. And therefore, I think it's the perfect moment to have an audience with such a wide theoretical knowledge to perhaps help us on proper interpretation on these findings. Okay, so shortly about the background of this paper. So I think we have a very straightforward, let's say, political motivation for this research, that of course, green technologies are really at the core of any endeavors to achieve sustainable growth. And this is especially prominent for the European Union, where green technologies really take like the center stage in a lot of the strategies set out by the European Commission, for example. At the same time, of course, we do have the scientific literature, which both shows that, yes, green technologies, environmental innovations do improve environmental productivity, which is what we want, but of course, that there might as well be gains in terms of economic productivity. So do we actually get more productive by employing these new technologies? And this second trait is actually what we are interested in, because if green technologies also increase economic productivity, then of course they can serve as kind of a stimulator to regional growth. And thereby, of course, our research is also linked to the whole political motivation surrounding cohesion policies by the European Union about the question, how do we achieve that not some regions get very rich and completely off the chart, whereas others fall behind, but to think about, okay, could green innovation perhaps also be a way to achieve this goal of making regions kind of converge to some degree? So the research question we are aiming at in this paper is, what is the impact of green technology development on economic productivity of European regions? And to the best of our knowledge, this is kind of the first study that looks at a regional, but also we are not aware of such analysis at a national level. But so far, the evidence is pretty much limited either to the firm level, where some studies point towards the fact that for green technologies, there might be rather lower returns to it compared to normal innovations, and or that these effects are kind of heterogeneous across different green technology fields, because of course it might make sense that green technologies that are resource saving or saving energy, which are cost factors, have a different productivity effect compared to end-of-pipe solutions, for example. And there is also a few of analysis at the sector level, which also find rather small positive returns to green innovation with potentially also U-shaped relationships, so an effect of quadratic terms. But there's so far no evidence at, for example, a regional level, where we do by design take into account intra-regional spillovers, where we could have an effect of structural change in the region that is being fostered by green technology development. And this is why we consider this research question to be of relevance and to be also suited to be analyzed at the regional level. And with that, I would like to already quickly jump into how we are tackling this empirically. So we aim to estimate a logarithmized aggregate production function, which is relatively standard in the literature since being introduced by Grilliches. We're actually just next to capital and labor as standard factors. You do have knowledge capital, which we introduce as distinguished into green and non-green or polluting, dependent on how you want to term it. And then, of course, we do have an error term in this model, which consists of the region fixed effect and then the regular error term, which I will say a few words more about in a second.
So, Tobias, what do you mean by gross value added?
How do you mean?
Like, I mean, is gross output or value added?
Value added.
But you say gross value added. What does the gross part in value added?
It's output valued at basic prices minus intermediates at purchaser prices. I think that's
value added.
Yeah, yeah. I can look into the exact definition after the talk. But, okay, so the sample we have is at the NUTS2 level for European regions. And in the working paper, we had like for as many regions as possible, and then for only 25 years. In this revised version, because of the properties of our estimation techniques, we tend to go as the main sample for a sample of 158 regions, which are solely located in the EU 15 countries and Norway, so the rather developed economies. But then we can kind of get a time dimension from 1980 to 2018, which gives us some nice room for movement. But we also test our main findings then again for a sample where we have more heterogeneous regions in it, also from Eastern European economies. But in that case, then we drop to a time dimension of 24 years. And for this paper, we utilized primarily two data sources. So our data on value added, employment, and capital inputs is from the ADECO database, which offers regional data for European regions and Norway and I think Switzerland, if I'm remembering correctly. And then for constructing knowledge capital, we rely on RECPA 2021, where we construct patent counts on green and total patents from, and by that construct our green measure as green patents and our non-green measure as total patents minus the green patent counts, and then we construct standard knowledge diffusion stocks as used prominently in papers by Pop, Agian, and others, which is why I don't want to put too much focus on here.
Can you at least remind us the depreciation rate?
The depreciation rate is, I think, 0.15.
And it's the same for both the green and the other ones?
Exactly, exactly. And we also conduct robustness checks where we just use knowledge stocks by perpetual inventory methods. Yeah. So where we do not, where we only account for the depreciation rate, but we don't have this diffusion function as in these stocks, because here the diffusion coefficient is set in a way that the effect of the patent actually maximizes after 4 years roughly. So you do not have the strong immediate effect, but you have the valuation of the patent increasing until year 4, and then I think after year 4 it starts to decline. That is like the basic setup. Yeah, and then as a control, we utilize National Energy Price Index from the IEA, which I will say something more about in a minute when we come to the results. And in wanting to estimate this, of course, we are facing various empirical challenges. So one which we will try to tackle in more detail is the topic that, of course, these effects might not be identical across regions, but that actually the effects of knowledge capital could, of course, differ between regions. Then, of course, we need to take account of some time series properties like potential. Yeah.
Will you be talking about how this knowledge and patterns are tied to particular regions? How they are connected with the particular regions?
How it's tied to particular regions?
Yeah, because like general, there could be arguments that the knowledge is general and it has nothing to do with regions.
Okay. Yes, so what we are doing in this paper by the design of our estimation techniques is that we really focus on what is labeled private returns. So the effects that the innovation within one region has on the output of the region itself, and to control away the between region spillovers. Although I will also say something about that, but in principle, we try to control that away.
But did you maybe mention, so do you use the regional identity of the patent applicant, for example, I think the question was more about this. So how do you assign patents to regions?
Okay, we used in this case the inventor address to make it more, especially at the NUTS2 level, where of course you could otherwise have a substantial what is called head office bias. So in our main, for our main results, we assigned based on the inventor address, but we also conducted robustness checks where we assigned based on the applicant address.
And patents filed by when there are multiple inventors from different regions?
Then we have fraction counts.
Okay, could be also relevant for spillover.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Could you somehow remind us what is actually meaning this nuts? Like say in France, how many of these regions you have? Or in some other country,
I'm not 100% sure, but I think France also has a lot. In Germany, it's 38 regions. So NUTS1 would be the federal states, at least in Germany. Then you have like NUTS2, it's around about 38 or 40. And I don't know the English term, but so in general, I think also in France, it's like 20 to 25 regions. But what of course should be said about it, NUTS is really an administrative boundary. So it's not necessarily, that's also one of the reasons why we went on the NUTS2 level and not NUTS3, because at NUTS3, it gets very difficult and perhaps arbitrary in terms how the boundaries are being set. Whereas at NUTS2, you can still kind of reasonably consider it because, for example, in Germany, a city like Hamburg, which also is a federal state, is like one NUTS2 region. And of course, you might consider that as its own innovation system also to some degree.
Okay, essentially my question was, so in Germany, you have around 30 of these regions.
Yeah.
So you like assign that somebody is from Hamburg, and does it really make difference whether the address of inventories in Hamburg or in Bonn?
So you mean
that's a question which I got.
Yeah. So you mean the general question of whether it should make a difference to have the innovation at the regional level compared to just taking the whole of Germany?
It's just a question whether it really makes a difference whether the inventor has an address in this part of the Germany or the other part of the Germany.
Okay, yeah.
Because like the patent is filled at least for the Germany, maybe for the whole European Union.
And absolutely. I mean, that's really a conceptual question about what are the potential channels of why there should even be an effect of that. And of course, one consideration, however, still is that, for example, if you have the inventor in a particular region, if this person is earning an income, that would perhaps affect the region, but also, let's assume there's at least an overlap between also inventor and applicant, then of course, if this technology is used by a firm in order to create a new product that is being sold, but also licensed for others to use it, of course, this money, this value actually does go into the pocket of the region. And that's of course like a fundamental assumption in the whole thing, that it's a meaningful measure to have patents at a regional level to actually link it to productivity. Although this is in the respective literature relatively established. So of course, it's something on of course the whole assigning of patent data, on which I think you can fill huge debates, of course, but in the respective literature it would be well accepted that at such a regional level it does make sense. And indeed, I'm aware of some ongoing research where it's actually also analyzed. Does, for example, the inventor address really make sense to assign inventive activities in a meaningful way, also taking into account, for example, commuting streams? And in this research, the current findings, as I know them, is that indeed at the NUTS2 level, this does make sense. I would go along with you, for example, at NUTS3 level, that it gets, of course, much more difficult to argue for the link. Yeah. Okay, yeah, but I think already interesting points for potential discussion afterwards. We have quite a few potential empirical challenges which we want to tackle in our approach. And as I said, so of course, for example, the properties of the estimators, for example, give an argument why we now want to focus on this sample with a longer time series, because most estimation techniques, of course, require actually large T and large N. So there with a T of 39, we get much closer to that. And particular focus, and this relates to the topic of private returns, is that in this paper, we try to viciously control for cross-sectional dependence. So we try to control away potential between region spillovers to really focus on the returns to the knowledge capital of the respective region, which is by now recently stressed in various studies that this is important to take into account in such an empirical setting. Okay, so perhaps just very briefly on what lies behind that econometrically. So for that, we consider an error model in which we could, in principle, have two different forms of cross-sectional dependence. And I do not want to go into too much detail here, but what we should be concerned about is what is labeled strong cross-sectional dependence, which actually means that there are some unobserved common factors that affect all the regions at the same time, with potentially different loadings, however. So it could be, if you take, for example, the financial crisis, that does affect regions differently, but it's still a common factor that affects them in one way or the other. And by using this error structure also, what can actually be done is to really flexibly account for those dynamics, because the standard way you would do in many empirical applications is to just have time effects. So one time dummy per year to capture, for example, the financial crisis. And this is like one special case that is nested by this error structure, but this error structure even allows then these heterogeneous loadings of the different regions, which is a nice feature to really reasonably control for these issues. And the reason why we are concerned about that is because if we would have this strong cross-sectional dependence and we do not account for it, that might disturb unbiasedness and consistency of the estimators, which is why, as I said, also in related studies, it's really harnessed that we should take this into account. Okay, and just very shortly to also motivate why this is relevant for us, to test whether this is the case, you can estimate the so-called exponent of cross-sectional dependence. And this is this alpha hat estimate. And if this is equal to 1, this is that you have strong cross-sectional dependence in the data. And if we look here that we have the 90% confidence bands of our alpha estimate, we see that for all the variables we use in our model, the alpha equals 1 is within this confidence band. So it's pretty sure that cross-sectional dependence in the variables we are taking into account could be a problem, which is a reason why we need to tackle this empirically. Okay, So a few words then on our estimation approach. So in generally, we use a few different estimation methods in order to relax a little bit our dependence on specific assumptions of the respective estimators. But based on the cross-sectional dependence test, we choose the common correlated effects estimator, in short CCE, as our, in principle, preferred method. And what this estimator actually does is that the cross-sectional averages of the dependent and all independent variables are just added into the equation. And then you can have, for each region, a different parameter with which this cross-sectional average is of relevance. And this might also a little bit, make it more relatable. Also, one of the criticisms that you could have about this estimation technique is that it controls away a lot. Because if you think about the standard time dummy, that would, in a case with 39 years, that would mean you have 38 parameters. And in the case of the CCE estimator, you have in our setting, you have the one dependent variable, the 4 independent variable. So you have 5 parameters. But since they can be unit specific, you have in our case 158 regions times the 5 parameters. So you really control a lot away. You have to estimate a lot of parameters, which is also why a potential critique of this estimator can be that you might control way too much variation and have too little left for finding the effects. Any question?
So you're choosing that based on tests rather than on whether n is greater than t, because that's what's going on in the literature, is that some estimators are better suited depending on whether the time series is longer than the dimension, because that's how they do the asymptotics.
Yeah, exactly. So this is an aspect that we also take into account, because also if our t would even be larger, we would also have some additional options that then have some other properties, but which are more biased up to t equals 50 or so. So we also take this aspect into account. But then, for example, for the estimation techniques, which all profit from large n, large t, then this cross-sectional dependence, especially when trying to estimate these returns to knowledge, is really emphasized as a very fundamental empirical issue, which is why we kind of focus on it so much. Although, of course, in line with that, we also always employ two-way fixed effects and first difference estimator, where also it's a little bit more straightforward to understand where do the results actually come from, what is in there. And also it might be valuable to say that in similar settings, it has been shown that first difference estimator with time dummies also usually performs relatively well, also to purge this cross-sectional dependence away. So we think that with a setup of estimators, we are relatively well set up to account for the data properties. Okay, and with that, I'll shortly check my time, because as I said, like the main focus is on the results. So our main findings in our basic setup is, I will leave away the results on capital and labor, which are actually much in line with the respective literature. But what we find for our knowledge capital stocks is that for green knowledge, as you can see here, we do not find any significant effects on productivity, whereas for the non-green knowledge stock, we do indeed find significant effects with an effect size of roughly 0.02, which can be interpreted here as elasticities, which also is a little bit reassuring that we see here. As said, although the CCE estimator takes away a lot of variation, which is why it might not be good to overemphasize if something is not always significant, but in this setup, even with a CCE estimator, the effect remains slightly significant here.
So Tobias, the knowledge stock, both the green and the non-green, is the log of the stock measure that you have created, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Do you get any zeros? Like,
yeah, we use this technique that was also used by Agian et al. In the 2016 paper that you insert a dummy when a region or an observation has a zero knowledge stock to take this out. The other move that is often made is that you take 1 plus the logarithm of the knowledge stock.
So another question that I have here, I mean, again, why do you estimate a value-added production function and not the gross output? I mean, material inputs, they account for almost 60 to 70% of, like the costs of firms and I guess regions. So why wouldn't you control it as an input directly? And then instead of, like assuming that you have a Leontief production where the parameter is equal to one of the output elasticity materials. Is it because of data constraints or?
I need to think about it for a moment.
Because that might something be interesting to check,
Yeah.
Because if it's correlated somehow with also your stock measures.
Yeah.
You would like to know that.
Yeah. No, that's a good point to also check for the GDP. One data constraint of GDP, at least in that setup, we will come to that later, is that I think there was no sectoral level data then on it. And we wanted to also do this in an extension, but I will write it down because, of course, it's a good point to check that for robustness.
And I mean, further to that, you started your presentation and you're talking about efficiency, like environmental efficiency plus, like efficiency of the production function. But how would you model an environmental efficiency? And if it's an important one, why is not showing up in your estimator here? Or do you somehow account for it?
So you mean why in this paper we do not focus on environmental efficiency?
Yeah, how would environmental efficiency show up in a production function if it would show up as a concept? And if it's important, why you don't control for it? Because you might be capturing to a certain extent environmental efficiency, or that then has an impact on productivity.
Yeah, but conceptually, I mean, that's exactly what we are interested in. That of course. You could have this co-benefit, for example, that if you if you increase your energy efficiency, that this should also show up as economic productivity because you save the costs on the input factor, but it's like a different concept.
So in this case, you cannot separate the two, right? Can you?
Okay, so you mean whether we have data on it?
No, can you separate whether you're actually estimating environmental efficiency? So the productivity efficiency you get here, is it environmental efficiency or true physical efficiency?
No, we cannot distinguish that.
That's
so we don't know whether it's really because you increased energy efficiency or whether it's because for some green products, there's just a larger market with a better ratio of inputs to value added, for example. We cannot, yeah.
So you don't have data at the regional level on environmental outcomes or energy use?
No, we don't have it. We checked for it, and there are some for individual countries. And I know that by now, I think there's a plant level data set, even at NUTS 3 level on emissions, but we don't have for such a sample like a coverage of, let's say, emission data or energy data at a NUTS 2 level. At least we didn't find it. Any further on that, or?
Maybe that's what you're going to talk about next. But have you calculated the contributions? Because here you're just showing the coefficients, but the growth accounting, people would typically do the whole growth accounting, so you would.
Yeah, that corresponds to it, like as the shares, yeah.
But I mean, here is just the regression coefficients from the log of knowledge stock on, sorry, the log of productivity on the log of knowledge stock, right?
So the dependent variable is log value added, and then it's the log knowledge stock, yeah.
Right. But I mean, you could have from that derived the word growth accounting, and say, this much of growth is due to physical capital, this much of growth is due to labor, this much of growth is due to TFP, that would be a residual. But here you're saying actually part of growth of TFP is due to this unmeasured green and non-green knowledge stock.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's conceptually what we have, that by controlling for the input factors, you then have kind of the explanation of TFP through the knowledge stocks. Yeah.
So it would be interesting to know how much of TFP, because we don't know, because we don't know the mean of your log of knowledge stock, right? So we cannot even do the multiplication in our head to just get the magnitude.
Yeah, that's a very good point, to look at also the average change in the knowledge stocks to know what their elasticity. Yeah, thank you. That's a good point. Okay, I'll try to write with as fast as I can. Yeah, so this is kind of the first main result. So thank you already for these points. I hope on the next results there will perhaps be even some more. So perhaps just shortly to back this up, on these main results we conducted various robustness check. One was that we included the national energy price, because of course one consideration might be that the positive effect of the green knowledge stock might be hidden by the fact that, for example, you have rising energy prices, which might lower output, and at the same time you then have induced innovation, such that if they are correlated, you kind of underestimate the effect of green knowledge capital. But when including at least the national energy price index, unfortunately, we don't have the regional data. As you can see, the effects remain pretty much identical.
But Tobias, here you actually estimating a physical production function, so prices don't really pop up anywhere. So I don't really see why the national energy price is necessarily something that would help you in controlling. I mean, here it's everything in principle is like on physical stocks, right? So prices, or like the demand side, let's say, it's kind of like netted out. So and here you say, okay, let's include national energy price. It also doesn't vary at the regional level. So I don't know to what extent this is also accounted by the structure of your error term to control for actually something that is related to like physical output. I mean, if those changes had happened anyway, it would show up on the output at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, I think that's a very good and interesting point. Perhaps we can discuss that in more detail after the talk, because this was indeed driven by a comment that we should somehow try to account for this potential induced innovation problem. And this was like, given the data we have available, our best shot at somehow taking this into account. But of course, you're right.
Do you mind repeating what is the problem again?
The suggestion was that we might underestimate the effect of the green knowledge stock, because it could be the case that, for example, you have a shock to the energy price, which in the short run might lower output. And however, that the higher energy price also triggers more green innovation. And that then, of course, because it's correlated, you think, okay, green innovation kind of has a negative effect on output, but in reality, the factor behind it is the rise in the energy price, and you just incorrectly, you actually have an omitted variable bias due to that. Okay. But yeah, I think that's an interesting point to discuss afterwards, because we were also thinking about, whether this really helps. This is a shot at it, and also, of course, therefore interesting that.
Because if the shock is exogenous, I mean, you have a whole error term and you really control for a bunch of things. So I don't see why you need to directly control for it.
Yeah, but perhaps there, the shock has to be European-wide. So the unobserved common factors that you have, they have to apply for all regions. So for example, a national shock to the energy price would not be accounted for by it. But yeah, as I said, that's like a very detailed aspect. So I would love to discuss that in more detail perhaps afterwards, to try to get through the results part, to have your thoughts on that as well. So this is just another kind of robustness exercise where we've written the model in intensive form, so divided by labor. And in this specification, also the effects remained relatively similar. So to have like a short intermediate summary on these findings is that in general, we found a significant productivity effect by non-green innovation. However, we did not find such returns to green innovation. And we also tested a few additional things that, for example, we checked whether there might be like a U-shaped relationship. So we controlled for square term of the green knowledge stock, which didn't show up to be significant. We also did not find compelling evidence for knowledge complementarity, so an interaction between the green and the non-green knowledge stock. And we also ran this model also for the sample with more regions where the effects pretty much remained similar. And with that, I would like to go to the part where we are currently struggling in terms of interpreting the results, because of course, the question that arises is, okay, are these effects now the same across all regions, or are there differences between regions? And if so, where might they come from? And to kind of tackle this point, we introduced here an interaction of knowledge capital with the economic structure of the region proxied by the industry share, which is, for example, motivated by the fact that, of course, patents strongly apply to industry, to manufacturing, so that we might, of course, expect, okay, this plays a role here. And the interesting dynamic that we find then, indeed, is that there is an interaction effect, which looks in the way that we see for the green knowledge stock, the baseline effect becomes negative, but just as baseline effect, of course, it wouldn't make much sense, ceteris paribus, to have an increase in knowledge, reduce output. But that at higher levels of the industry share, the productivity effects of the green knowledge capital tend to increase. And as for the interaction effect, we utilize the average output share of the region to really have this interaction effect solely capturing a different effect across regions. So to avoid, of course, that otherwise in an interaction effect, the within and between dimension can kind of mix up. And this really only captures that a region with an on average higher industry share has a larger return to green innovation and a lower return to non-green innovation. So the example here would actually be that if you, let's say, if you have a region with 20% industry share, these two terms kind of cancel out. And for example, if now you have a region with 30% industry share, that region has a substantial productivity effect then by green innovation as well. Yeah.
In industry share, you mean manufacturing?
No, industry sector, which is in the data we have manufacturing and energy, and also there would have to check whether we had this at 6 sector data where we could really take manufacturing and energy, or whether it even also contains construction. But I think we had it at 6 sector levels, so we could take really manufacturing and energy. But this ADECO data is not available at a lower level of disaggregation.
And why did you not run the regression at the sector region level?
We have an extension on it, but in general, because we really wanted to account for this potential of structural change, so that that of course precisely if you have other studies that look at a sectoral level, then you know, okay, what happens within the sectoral level, but you don't know the potential of, for example, green innovation to perhaps foster structural changes as well. And we wanted to take this into account as well. So because, of course, for example, the growth effect of green technologies might be that it fosters a larger service sector in related services. But we do indeed have an extension on it where we also analyze it for industry and services, which I will come to in a moment. And then, of course, we considered also whether, of course, we don't really know yet, like, okay, is this just correlation or is this really causal? Because of course, for the industry share, we only have a cross section basically. So that's unfortunately not that easy. So the step that we did was that we thought about, okay, what could be other mediating factors? And of course, the first one to come up with could be the size of the region, both either measured as population, if we think about spillovers across people, for example, but also, of course, by the size of the economy by output. And for an interaction with output, we didn't find any significant interaction effect. So I leave that by the wayside. But for population, we actually found an interaction effect that goes into a very similar direction. So we, again, by tendency, less pronounced here, but by tendency, we also here have this dynamic that the effect of green, seemingly at least the magnitude here, tends to grow with a larger population in the region, whereas for non-green knowledge, the larger the region, kind of the effect tends to get smaller. And again, here we took the average population of the whole time frame for the region, and this is just the log of population in person. So in short, if you kind of plug the values in to figure out what does that tell me, actually also in terms of the effect sizes, this interaction with population tells you a very similar story compared to the interaction with industry share. So for example, if you look at what is the suggested effect of non-green and green knowledge at the mean compared to one standard deviation above the mean for a region, then you come here at very similar effect sizes also. However, then the step that we did to kind of think about, okay, is it now a genuine effect by the economic structure? Is it a genuine effect by the size, by the number of people in the region? What we did is that we did a specification where we included both interaction terms, which of course is relatively demanding in terms of specification. That's certainly an issue here. But the tendency that we found here is that the interaction effect of the industry share interaction remained relatively similar, whereas for the population interaction, this more or less went away. So these findings we interpret as of now kind of into the direction, okay, there seems to be a genuine interaction caused by the industry structure, by the economic structure, although of course this might be a point also for discussion in how far this is the case. And to consider a little bit further whether this might indeed be the case, we did another exercise where we pre-selected the regions based on their average industry share and looked at the top quartile, so those regions with the highest industry share compared to the bottom quartile, those with the lowest. And these findings then kind of have the advantage that we don't need to specify the interaction term, but we just pre-select our sample, so to say. And indeed, those findings then kind of supported what we see with respect to the interaction term, because this is for the regions with the highest industry share. And here you can see actually the productivity effects of green and non-green knowledge, while insignificant, have pretty much equalized. So in terms of magnitude here, the green knowledge stock would even have a larger effect.
But I mean, Tobias, I think here, if we want to say if it's larger or smaller, we need to test it. I mean, and based on the standard errors, in principle, they were never that different, right? Irrespective of the, I mean, they're also insignificant. So I mean,
yeah, I mean, that's always
to make a claim that they have been equalized. I would imagine, right?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of equalizing, if I make it easy, I say it's not significant, so it could just be zero in both cases. So I don't see a significant difference, at least, because I think the way kind of we make sense of these findings is that, for example, if we look at the bottom quartile, there we do see some evidence towards, okay, non-green knowledge does have a significantly different effect than green knowledge. And in the other sample, we don't see this. So this is kind of how we try to make sense of these results. Okay, so to shortly sum up this interaction part. So we do find some significant effect of the economic structure with respect to mediating these returns to knowledge, which would take the shape of at higher levels of industry share, you profit more from green knowledge compared to if you do not have a strong industry, or the other way around, at low levels of industry, you do profit significantly different from non-green knowledge compared to green knowledge, which is no longer the case for regions with a higher industry share. And this interaction effect is robust to a variety of specification decisions. But what I should say is that from the results we have gathered so far, the effect is rather constrained to the between dimensions. So when we take the whole variation into account for the interaction effect, so if we allow, for example, the industry share and the interaction to also vary both across time and across regions, then we do not see such a pronounced effect. So it seems to more be a suitable explanation to explain why a region that is structurally more industry intensive has a different effect. And what might also be said that in the larger region sample for a shorter time frame, we also found this effect to be less pronounced, which might be good to know perhaps for the discussion. And then a final exercise, which I want to show here is indeed, of course, this consideration might just be that, especially a measure like patents just is differently related to productivity in the sectors. So what we did is to look at also the agricultural sector, but there we didn't find any real effect. So I leave that out here, but to focus on the comparison between industry and services. And interestingly enough, however, we do not see any evidence here that the effect would just be more pronounced in the industry sector, because of course that would have been very straightforward if we would just have within the industry sector, there is a larger effect. Okay, if I have a larger industry share, then of course I have on average also a larger effect from it, but we do not see evidence on that. In fact, even the effect is a little bit larger for services than it is for industry here. Although of course, so it's the same measures of the knowledge stocks related then to the sectoral data. Okay, so with that, I managed to go through all results at least. So in general, we have these two main findings as of now that we are trying to make sense of. First, that we do not see evidence for private returns to green innovation, whereas we find productivity effects of non-green technologies. And this effect is, I would say, quite robust to various empirical decisions. And the second aspect, which, I'm also very interested in what you think about, is that we think to find a mediating role of the regional economic structure, that for the more industrialized regions, the returns to green tend to increase, for non-green tend to decrease. And indeed, what the results point towards is that this seems to be a more relevant interaction explanation for heterogeneous effects than a region size. However, we do not find evidence within the sectors that just within industry would have larger returns to it. And we also seem to have evidence towards that this really explains the different effects across regions, but that there's not such a strong interaction within a region that, let's say, if a region increases its industry share by 1%, that this has a differential effect on the productivity gains from knowledge capital. Yeah, so these are our findings. And I'm very much looking forward to your comments, thoughts, suggestions. Thank you.
Have you looked at the specific types of green technology? So to my knowledge, most of the patents are in energy and transportation. And I could imagine that the industrial structure of regions interacts with the types of patents which are filed in regions?
With these new results, we have not yet managed to run this as well. But perhaps what can be said in the working paper, we did that. And there, interestingly enough, we didn't find a difference across the subcategories. But with these results, we haven't done that yet. So we will definitely do that. Yeah.
Data question. Like in your data for each patent, you have some binary classification, green, non-green patent, or you have to somehow create this classification. No, my question is essentially which patents are green and which are not green, and how do you get this distinction?
So we use this YO2 classification scheme, which is conducted, I think, by the European Patent Office itself, right? Yeah, so they kind of provide a classification scheme that they say these patents relate to green technologies, and then it's just a corresponding technology class code based on which we assign that.
So is it like that for each patent you have a binary classification, green, non-green?
Yes, yeah. So you don't,
But maybe just as an extension, and maybe this explains a little bit these codes. So for example, they're for renewable energies, but there are also technologies like clean combustion technologies.
Yeah.
And maybe if you look into more disaggregate technology classes, so there are also green agriculture technologies, and these codes are assigned by the patent office and by the experts, and I think it's better just to trust them. But of course, it always makes sense to check the microdata. But maybe the distinction between these gray types of inventions, which is clean combustion, for example, just putting an end of pipe, I mean, you could interpret this as an end of pipe innovation, whether this makes any difference to more radical types of green innovation.
Yeah.
And I was also a little bit wondering about the time lag structure in your setting, because I would expect that the gains of doing radical innovation are more lagged in time. So you invest or you invent renewable energy technologies now, and now it's costly, but it will pay back.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly, of course, a fundamental question in the setting. So on the one hand, I would say concerning the effects of the different technologies, I mean, if I would want to make it very pragmatic, I could, of course, argue, since I'm interested in the economic returns, so for example, for environmental returns, it's pretty straightforward why different technologies have different effects or different indicators. But of course, I could argue, if I'm interested in economic productivity, I might just be interested in, okay, is there an effect to end of pipe, which I could sell still, similar to anything else? Yeah, but what do you mean exactly in terms of qualifying radical innovation in this setting? What would
so I mean, I know there are certain definitions, but I would apply a more conceptual definition and just say everything that is not a gray innovation, not an end of pipe solution, is a radical green technology. Okay. And this would be also interesting. I believe that in the paper you mentioned somewhere the Porter hypothesis.
Yeah.
And very often the Porter hypothesis was investigated by only looking at end of pipe solutions, by just putting a filter on a coal power plant, and this is a green innovation. But I think in the short term that this might be more cost effective rather than doing more radical innovations. But in the long term, there might be actually some studies who have made this. I just know there are some studies that have shown that that environmental regulation has triggered more radical in green inventions. And I think so far it was not yet shown whether or not this has an economic benefit.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point to go into. Indeed, we were also thinking about this. I think in the paper we also discussed it towards the end that, of course, one consideration could be that, let's say in the 80s, there just wasn't the market yet for green technologies, but that, of course, that might change now. I think on that question, of course, it's a little bit the question how to tackle this empirically.
Yeah, maybe you could make use of the learning curve literature, which could be an indicator of the technological maturity of specific types. Or I don't know how to implement this, but if you want to invest another few months of research.
I mean, I think we intend to really, make this as good as we manage. But I think that's definitely a point to, perhaps we can after the seminar talk about that.
I had a question. In the beginning, you showed some slides on the literature of why green technologies would have better returns. Can you make sort of the data work towards those hypotheses? Let's say if it's really about the competing technologies, where you say green renewable energy has higher returns than conventional energy, or like EVs have higher returns than conventional cars. Insert this knowledge base.
I think the detail of these papers on it, the literature is still, I would argue, surprisingly scant. So I think going into even more detail also on the different technologies could certainly be interesting, perhaps better suited at a firm level. But so one paper that does something similar, for example, they distinguished ICT, nanotechnology, biotechnology, and then the more general green, for example. And in that paper, at least, green had less strong returns compared to, for example, I think ICT and nano, if I remember correctly. So there's this, it's by Stucki and Wörter from 2019. And there they at least have like these 4 technologies, I think, where they say these are new growth technologies, and they look at that and they do find some differences in the effects between the different technologies.
Because I guess now in your data set, green includes things like biotech or semiconductors.
Exactly. I mean, in this setup with this, like, I mean, this kind of taxonomy, let's say, is at this moment very raw, because it's really everything that somehow falls not in this classification of green is just treated as non-green. And of course, I think what your argument was heading towards, that a patent can also be somewhere at an intersect, that is, of course, with respect to the data, not captured in too much detail. Okay, don't see questions in the chat.
So then we would finish perfectly in time.
Yeah, perfect. Then thank you very much. And thanks for giving me the opportunity.
There's actually one with the classifications of green technologies. See you later.